Hey, this is Russell Moore, and this is our second episode of Reading in Exile. For those of you who are new, I'm just sort of going through my library, pulling things out and talking about things that I like or don't like, or books that maybe you should check out or leave aside. And I asked people yesterday, and I want you to keep giving me your recommendations about what you'd like for us to talk about. And a lot of people said, knowing that I'm a Wendell Berry fan, said Wendell Berry. And a lot of people specifically said this book, which is Jayber Crow by Wendell Berry. This is not my favorite Wendell Berry novel, although it is very good, as I'll talk about later. I think my favorite is Hannah Coulter, which maybe we'll talk about later on. So when I pulled this off the shelf and opened it up, the first thing that I noticed that I'd forgotten about, and I posted this on Instagram, is this signing, signed with pleasure for Russell Moore, June the 20th, 2010, Wendell Berry. I think, if I'm remembering right, that I took this with me went out to his farm sometimes out in Henry County, Kentucky. And I think I took this with me and had him sign. I'll never forget that time. So when you talk about Jayber Crow, a lot of things you have to keep in mind. One of those things is it's not easy to tell you what the book is about if what you're wanting is a plot, because it's not a plot-driven novel. It's a world sort of building novel connected with the others about this little community, Port William, Kentucky, fictional community, but really based off of where he lives. And this idea of membership, of belonging to one another. So if you're familiar with Wendell Berry, you'll know he's what a lot of people call an agrarian. Meaning that Berry thinks that society functions best if people are involved in working the land. Not everybody, but where the economy is sort of rooted in that, and people belong to one another. So it's about this young man, Jayber Crow, starts out as a young man who feels a call to ministry. Even that is really ambiguous, because he sort of feels like he ought to have a 1 Samuel 3 sort of "Here I am, Lord" kind of a call. And the book leaves it a little ambiguous as to what the nature of that calling actually is. That's what he's looking for. He wants to be a preacher. He goes to Bible college. But he has this real sense of disillusioning with his call. He ends up being a barber and a church sexton, which is essentially keep up the grounds, maintain the bell, sometimes even grave digger, those sorts of aspects of life. And he has this sense of unrequited love for this woman. He can't have her. She's married to somebody else. And so he just sort of pines for her throughout this book. But let me just share with you, again, it's been a long time since I've reread Jayber Crow, but I have it in front of me. And let me just look at the things that I've sort of marked to kind of tell you, why I liked this book. The first thing is he's talking about the war. This is set right before World War II. And he talks about the effect of the war on communities like his. And he says this here. He says, "When I was younger, from what I had felt and read and seen in pictures, I had imagined war as a great blind force, like a hard wind at night that trampled and bloodied the ground, leaving behind only loose stones and splinters and bodies torn in pieces. This new war, like the previous one, would be a test of the power of machines against people and places. Whatever its causes and justifications, it would make the world worse. This was true of that new war, and it has been true of every new war since. The dark, monstrous thing comes and tramples the little towns and never even knows their names. It would make Port William afraid and shed its blood and grieve its families and damage its hopes." So he's talking about what war does to little communities. You can see the same sort of concern with like Russell Kirk, mid-century, about about war. Some of this in what Dwight Eisenhower talked about with the military-industrial complex, but more so here. And so Berry says, I was glad enough that I had not become a preacher and so would not have to go through a war pretending that Jesus had not told us to love our enemies. So that's a theme through here, is this reluctance about war and about the Sermon on the Mount. And so at one point, he's talking to somebody about using the language of if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other. And the person he's talking to says, where did you learn this nonsense? And he says, well, it was from Jesus Christ. So, abstracting out what you think about just war, those sorts of conversations, what I pick up from this is something that Walker Percy talks about in Signposts in a Strange Land, about how in the Bible Belt, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes sound distant, that they don't make sense because the religion is really more Greek Stoicism than it is Christianity. The very fact that it's not that you have people trying to sort through how does this action, maybe how does Romans 13 comport with the Sermon on the Mount. It's that the Sermon on the Mount seems on its face ridiculous, so it doesn't even need to be talked about. That's sort of a concern that he has throughout this book. He also talks about a lot in this book about the fact that he thinks of this as a book about heaven. And what he means by that is not life after death. Berry he's a Baptist. He goes to a Baptist church. When he goes, that was one of the sort of rebukings that he had of me several times when we would visit, is that his church would have seminary students that would come in and leave very quickly. They didn't set down roots. And I would always say, "Oh, Mr. Berry, you're paying them $50 a week. They can't live. They have to sort of be there while they're in seminary." That shows up in this book. I mean, that's sort of the experience of Jayber Crow. And he goes from sort of living that kind of life to being rooted in a community where there's an image of membership here that's very similar to what the Apostle Paul would talk about in 1 Corinthians, one body, many members. But it's not referencing the church, although the church is a part of it. It's referencing the community in his view. And so he talks about, at one point, he said, "I am maybe the ultimate Protestant, the man at the end of the Protestant road. For as I have read the Gospels over the years, the belief has grown in me that Christ did not come to found an organized religion, but came instead to found an unorganized one." And that is really key to what Berry's going to be talking about almost every time that he references religion. And so you will have this novel, as it follows this man's life, will sort of stop and end up in some themes that you can find in Berry's essays elsewhere about how, in his view, Christianity, the way that we know it, tends to divide up body and soul. He'll talk about that. Stop to talk about what's happening with industrialization. The man who's married to the woman that he is secretly in love with is somebody who's a villain because he's using a tractor. He's tearing up the land. He's not really doing sustainable agriculture at all. And then beyond that, though, I think there's a theme of this book is about the narrative nature of life combined with the seemingly accidental nature of life. So I didn't think about this until last night when I was watching Forrest Gump with my kids, knowing where to click through and speed through. So we didn't watch all of it. We watched part of it. And that's actually what Gump is talking about at the end, is it seems that his life has been a story and it seems like his life has been a series of accidents. And he says, maybe it's both. Well, that's kind of listen to what Berry says. "I've made plans enough, but I see now that I never lived by plan, any more than if I had been a bystander watching me live my life. I don't feel that I ever have been quite sure what was going on. Nearly everything that has happened to me has happened by surprise. All the important things have happened by surprise. And whatever has been happening usually has already happened before I have had time to expect it. The world doesn't stop because you are in love or in mourning or in need of time to think. And so when I have thought I was in my story or in charge of it, I really have only been on the edge of it, carried along. Is this because we are in an eternal story that is happening partly in time? That is a really important passage to sort of getting what's happening in this book and seeing a life sort of from a bird's eye view of seeing what's happening in this man, but most importantly, this man as he is embedded in his community, embedded in the community that he aspires toward, being a preacher, and then the community as it is, where he's serving that community as barber, as sexton, as just member of the community. So this is well worth reading. I really would recommend it to you. Maybe now would be a really good time to read this because we're living in a really unpredictable, scary sort of time that feels a lot like Great Depression, pre-World War II sorts of time, even if it doesn't turn out to be that way, feels that way. And this is sort of a reminder of some of the more permanent things. So that's Jayber Crow. Let me know in the comments what you would like for us to talk about going forward. It's Reading in Exile. This is Russell Moore.